Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. It's Friday, June 20th, and I'm glad you're with me. I think this is wrapping up one of the most consequential weeks of my broadcasting life, and there have been a few. I wasn't around when the Berlin Wall fell. I was, however, when the Soviet Union fell apart, so that counted pretty high. And of course, 9/11 and the wars and many other things, elections, etc. But I think this week is going to rank among the most significant ever. To start off our Friday conversation about it, that will also be part of the big weekend pod at Highly Concentrated Hugh, National View's Jim Geraghty. Jim, I'm going to ask all my guests today, Matt Continetti, Ben Domenech, Eli Lake, pretty much the same question so people can contrast and compare. First question, is America better off this Friday, June 20th, than it was last Friday when Israel started its strikes on Iran?
Yes, because Iran has fewer ballistic missile launchers than it did at the beginning of the week. Because the Natanz facility sounds like it got hit pretty hard. Other Iranian nuclear facilities. Because there are lots of exciting opportunities for promotion in the Iranian military if you're in the lower ranks, because they keep needing a replacement. Kind of like the drummer in Spinal Tap. You know, you can get a lot of replacements. Spontaneous combustion keeps happening left and right there. So all of that is good. But I would hesitate or feel the need to emphasize, if this doesn't end with Fordow taken out, if this doesn't end with the Iranian nuclear program basically taken back to square one, then things get bad very, very quickly.
Well, then that's my second question. Should President Trump add American air power to the strikes, and will he?
Yeah. So you would expect, with my proud neocon alleged warmonger credentials, that I'd be absolutely 100% for this. I am tentatively for this, but I would point out there is no way that the Israelis would go into this conflict without a plan to take out Fordow. If that was, they would never completely rely on us. They didn't have any guarantee that Donald Trump would say, okay, yes, we will use our top tier bunker busters on this site. I don't know if the plan was a commando raid. I don't know if the plan was drones, or they have some saboteur or something. They must have had some other plan, and we were either plan A or plan B, or maybe plan C or something like that. If they have those other options, and the U.S., we could get to the result we want to without the U.S. having to play a role in this, I would prefer that option. If the U.S. gets involved, we know Iran will strike back somehow. I don't know, through proxy terrorist groups or something like that. If we could avoid that, I prefer that. Now, if we have to give some sort of covert assistance to a strike on Fordow, then that's great. I'll be honest, Hugh, I don't know what the president's going to do. He certainly sounded very resolute earlier in the week when he said unconditional surrender. There were reports that he had authorized the mission, but he had not given the go signal. I do think he probably was hoping that with this much pressure on Iran, that maybe they come to the table and say, okay, we'll give up our nuclear weapons program. But I don't know. And I don't know. The entire fate of the Middle East rests on the shoulders of Steve Witkoff right now. And I think that's a lot to expect of him.
I don't think it does. I think it just rests with Donald Trump. And my audience knows I think the president ought to green light it, and he ought to do it very soon. And the sooner it comes to an end, the better off we will be. And I think the world will be a much better place. I don't know about the regime. I just don't want those nukes. Now, here comes the harder question. You know what sunk costs are. Money that you put into something that you can't get back. Are Khamenei's sunk costs so great that he has no choice but to try and continue a program after it's blown to smithereens?
Yeah, in Netanyahu's interview with Bret Baier earlier this week, he made, they asked him, are you aiming for regime change? And he didn't say we're aiming for it, but he said it's a possible consequence of this, because the nuclear weapons program is what the regime has. It's not popular. The economy is not doing well. They're brutal. They're all constantly suppressing protests and all that stuff. The one thing they could say is, look, we are on the doorstep of having a nuclear weapon, and once we do that, no one can threaten us ever again. And we stand up to the great Satan, blah, blah, blah. And I figure if you're an Iranian on the street, you're looking at the last 45 years and saying, what have they gotten us? How have they made our lives better? They've oppressed us. They've beaten the hell out of us. They have suppressed us. They've faked election results. We've become the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism. We're a pariah state. Why are we keeping these guys around? And so I'd love to see the Iranians topple the mullahs and topple the Ayatollah. I think there's probably going to be a significant appetite to do that. I also recognize the U.S. cannot and Israel cannot impose new leadership. It's got to come from within. So as much as I'd like to see the regime go, I don't know if we can come out and say, yes, regime change is one of our objectives. And I think it's one of the reasons you didn't see. Nobody hates the Iranians more than Netanyahu, and not even he was willing to say it explicitly. Yes, we're trying to topple the regime.
Now, I also want to talk to you about the sunk costs of the Democratic Party, or more specifically, the sunk costs of President Obama and his merry band of podsters. The only people who have really been attacking me all week are Obama people, because I point out this is a very good thing that Israel is doing and a necessary thing for the world. But they have a lot of sunk costs. Do you think they're ever going to come to grips with the reality? And I think it's a factual, defensible proposition that the JCPOA was a nightmare and will never be repeated and not to have been adopted. But boy, those people are deeply embedded in holding up their idea of the world. Will they ever resolve?
Say, Hugh, you remember the stories of the Japanese soldiers left on an island who were trying to fight the war against the U.S. years after the war had ended? They may be comparable to that. But I would also point out that, like, if you're a Democrat, that's the easiest thing to say here. It's like, well, if we'd never abandoned the Iran deal, we wouldn't be in this situation. I get a little frustrated when President Trump says, if I'd been in charge, Russia never would have invaded Ukraine. And that might be the case, but you weren't. And this is where we are. The war's been going on for more than 3 years now. So what should we do in the here and now? Don't tell us what we should have done X number of years ago. I think the Obama team looks and sounds kind of ridiculous, when they say that their plan is, well, first we go back and we enact this agreement, which they in exchange for promises that they weren't going to develop nuclear weapons, we were going to send them pallets full of cash and billions of dollars that, of course, they use to sponsor terrorism all around the world. It's kind of like when Karen
I got to get one more question in, Jim. Sure. They're never going to change, and I gather you agree with me, but I want to know about what Nellie Bowles wrote in the Free Press this morning. She pointed out that the pro-Hamas people have become pro-Iranian people overnight, and that you might have had sympathy for the people of Gaza, but you really can't have sympathy for Iranian generals, nuclear scientists, and the evil people who run Iran. But they've made the switch. Do you think it's just bought and paid for by the NGOs of the left, or are people that stupid? You got a minute, Jim.
Gene Kirkpatrick said it best back in the 1980s. They always blame America first. And by the way, this is now no longer simply a purely left of center phenomenon. You can find folks on the right whose,
of course,
their North Star. Yeah, whatever the U.S. government is doing that is bad. I think some of this stems from the fact that, like, I have real beefs with Democrats, and I can rip into them and all that stuff, but they're not really my enemies, right? Iran, China, Russia. In some of these cases, I've been told, by the way, literally, I'm on their enemies list, right? So my sense is, domestic political opponents, they might really annoy me, but in the end of the day, they're Americans. They have the same rights as I do, and they may mean well. They just generally have, like, really terrible solutions that don't work. I think there are a whole bunch of people who don't see it that way. I think there are a whole bunch of people who say the people who I don't vote for are the biggest enemies in my life. They're the greatest threat to my life. And I'll worry about all these foreigners who are trying to kill me later on, which I think is completely wrong-headed.
It's not a good way to live your life. Jim Geraghty, you have a great weekend ahead. Do you have a robotics competition?
I do not. I'm on vacation next week, Hugh, so I will not be joining you next Friday. Consider this the official announcement.
Well, given the pace of events, I sure hope the world has still got electricity by the time we get there. Jim Geraghty, follow him.
Wilcox is going to work this out.
Follow him on X at Jim Geraghty. Listen to the Three Martini Lunch, and make sure you listen to The Editors, the podcast on which Jim frequently appears with Rich Lowry and the other National Review Musketeers. Thank you, Jim.